In this video, we'll be learning how to make an animated dropdown in React. The dropdown can also be closed by clicking anywhere outside it because we'll be using event listeners. And since we'll be making this component reusable and using best React practices, we can put anything inside the dropdown over here, such as this login form. And by using advanced React and CSS concepts, we'll be adding a cool feature where the positioning of the dropdown is dynamic based on the Y position of the dropdown, so that it never renders outside the page. So without much further ado, let's get started. So we have VS Code open and a basic boilerplate React project. In index.css, we're basically setting the margin and padding 0 for everything. In app.jsx, we just have some items we aren't rendering out right now, but we have two divs, and then inside that just some text. And in app.css, we're basically centering everything on the page and adding some background color. So before we get started, we need to install a library for icons. So we'll say npm install react-icons. And then once that's done, we can run npm run dev to start our application. And on the right hand side, we have our application up and running. So the next thing we want to do is create a few components which we'll be using. So we'll go into the src folder and create a components folder. And our dropdown will contain a few components inside it. So let's just make folders for them. The first folder will be the entire dropdown itself, which is the entire container. We'll have another component called the dropdown button, which is what you actually see before the dropdown is open. We'll have the dropdown content, which is the content that is rendered out once the dropdown opens. And then we'll add another item, the dropdown item, which is each individual element inside the dropdown content, inside the dropdown menu. And then for each of these, we'll create the JSX and CSS files. So we'll say dropdown.jsx, dropdown.css. So now that we're done making the files and the folders, we'll firstly go into dropdown.jsx, and this will be our main container for our entire dropdown. So we'll just write down RAFCE, and then we'll go back into app.jsx and replace this text by writing dropdown and auto import that and save it, and we see that it's being rendered out on the right hand side now. So our dropdown will take in two props. First will be the button text, and this is the text that gets rendered out before the dropdown is open. So we'll just say dropdown button. And the second thing it'll take in is the content. So this can be any React object, any HTML that we want to enter over here. So for now, we'll just send a p tag, which says hello world, and save that. So of course, it's not being rendered out right now because we need to go into our dropdown. And right now we just have this text, but instead we're supposed to have two children. Firstly is the button, which gets rendered out on the top, and then the dropdown content, which will be rendered out below that. So in dropdown button.jsx, we'll write down RAFCE and save that, and same with dropdown content. Now we can go back into dropdown.jsx. The first thing we'll add is the dropdown button, and the second thing we'll add below that is the dropdown content. And we can go ahead and save that. We see that just the text is being rendered out over here. So the next thing we want to do is take in the two props which we were sending to the dropdown, which is the button text and then the content. And then what we can do is we can pass it straight to the children. So the button text we'll pass as a child to the drop down button, and then the content we'll pass straight to the drop down content component. Firstly, let's focus on the button over here. So you'll see by passing in the button text via the curly braces between the two tags. And the way to accept that is to go into the drop down button component, and it'll have a special prop called children. And what we can do is inside this div, just render out the children prop. And now we see we have the drop down button text which we were sending from app.jsx. Another thing we want to add is an icon on the right hand side which either points down or up based on whether the drop down is open or closed. So after the children, we'll create a span. And for now, we'll say FA chevron down. And this is an icon which we can get from the library which we installed. So we'll say import FA chevron down from react-icons/FA. And now we see we have the text being sent to us as well as a down icon. So we're rendering everything we want inside the drop down button. Let's go to the drop down content. And similarly, we'll take in the children prop passed to us. And then between the divs, we'll render the children. And now we see we are rendering the p tag which we were getting from app.jsx. So you'll see both the button text and the content is being rendered now. So next, let's add some styling. We can begin with the drop-down button. So on the outermost div, we'll give it a class name, and we'll give it a class name of dropdown-btn. And for the span over here, we'll give it a class name of toggle-icon. Then we can import the CSS at the top. So we'll say import dot slash dropdown button dot CSS. So first we'll target the dropdown-btn. We'll say it should be display flex, align items to the center. The width should be able to fit the content. The padding should be 1 rem. The background color, we want that to be white. The border radius, we'll set that to be 0.5 rem. We'll give it a box shadow, and that will be an RGBA value of 149, 157, 165, and 0.2. And then for the box shadow, we also want to give it 0 pixels, 8 pixels, and 24 pixels of blur. And then we also want the cursor to be a pointer whenever we hover over the drop down. And now we see we have our drop down being rendered with the styling. Next, we'll target the toggle dash icon. So we'll say display flex, align items center, justify content to center, and margin left of 1 rem. And our drop down button looks a lot better now. Let's go to the drop down content, and all we need to do is give the div a class name of dropdown dash content and import dot slash dropdown content dot css. Over here for the dropdown content, we'll give it a position of absolute. Minimum width should be 100%. We'll make it a display flex, flex direction column. We'll align the items to the center. We'll give it a padding of 1 rem. We'll give it a margin on the top of 0.5 rem. We'll give it a background color of white, border radius of 0.5 rem. We'll give it a box shadow, and this will be the same as before, so we can just copy it from here. Since we never want the dropdown to be able to go outside the page, we also give it a max height, and we'll set that to be 40% of the viewport height. So it'll never go outside the page once we're done with all of the features where we calculate the dynamic positioning. Overflow Y, we want it to scroll in case there are more items than the height of the dropdown. And then we don't want the scroll bar to be visible, so we'll say scroll bar width to be none. And then just so it works on every browser, we'll say ms overflow style none, and we'll save that. We need to add another style to make sure that the scroll bar doesn't appear. So we'll say dropdown content dash webkit dash scroll bar and say width is 0 and height is 0. And now it fully disappears. And the last thing we have to do is just go into our dropdown.jsx, give the outermost div a class name of dropdown, import dot slash dropdown dot css, and here just define dot dropdown and position relative. This will just help the positioning of the content later on. So now we're ready to add some state to our dropdown. So we'll come to the top of the dropdown component and say const open and set open is equal to use state, and we'll set that initially to false. We need both our button and the content to change based on if it's open or not. So we'll just pass in both as the open prop, and then we'll create a function called const toggle dropdown, and inside that all we'll do is set open, get in the previous open value, and make it equal to the new open value, which is the opposite. And since the button will be controlling whether the dropdown is open or not, we can send it over as a prop. So we'll make a prop called toggle, and we'll pass in toggle dropdown. Let's first go into dropdown button, and with the children we're also taking in the open prop and the toggle prop which we just got. And firstly we'll say on click, just call the toggle function. Then we need to change the styling of our button based on whether the open value is true or not. So instead of using a plain string, we'll use string interpolation over here. And after dropdown-btn, we'll use these curly braces for some JavaScript logic, and we'll check if it's open, then add another style called button-open. Otherwise, don't add any other style, so null. Similarly, for the icon over here, if it's open, then we want to render the FA chevron up icon. Otherwise, we want to render the down icon. So now if we click on it, we see that the icon is changing from up and down. Now let's add some styling to the button as well so that we know that it's in the open state. So for that, we need to go into dropdown button.css and just say dot button dash open. In that case, add a border with RGB value 147.197.253. It should be 2 pixels and solid. And now we see we have a clear open and close state to our button. Similarly, in dropdown content.jsx, we'll take in the open prop and add in similar logic as before. So we'll replace the string and add some string interpolation. If open, then also add the content dash open class, otherwise add null. And then in dropdown content.css for dot content dash open, we want to give the opacity 1, and then back here in the dropdown dash content we want to give it the opacity of 0. So now if we click on the button, we see that the dropdown opens and closes. So right now we're still rendering the hello world. So let's work on the dropdown item. So RAFCE, it'll take in two props, children and on click. For the div, we'll just say class name is equal to dropdown dash item, and then on click is equal to on click. And then instead of drop down item, we'll render out children and save that. And we'll import dot slash drop down item.css. In dropdown item.css, we'll say dot drop down dash item, padding of 0.5 rem, margin of 0.1 rem, width of 100%, border radius of 0.5 rem, cursor of pointer. And then when we hover over the item, so dot drop down dash item colon hover, we will change the background color. So we'll set it to RGB 240, 249, 255 and save that. And now we need to actually use it. So we'll go into app.jsx, and if you see the items over here, it's an array from 1 to 8. So what we'll do is go inside content and delete the p tag we have over here and create an empty fragment. Inside that, we'll add some curly braces and we'll say items dot map, get the current item, and we'll return drop down item. The key will be equal to the item value, and inside we'll render some curly braces and we'll say with string interpolation item and the given item, and we'll render that out. And as you can see, it's being rendered out over here, and when we hover over it, it changes the background color. And hopefully now you see the benefit of the content prop, because we can basically pass in anything over here, such as this list of items, or we could pass in a login form or anything you want. By the way, if you're liking the video until now, do subscribe and join the Discord server link down in the description and comments down below. So now that we have the proper content being rendered out, we're ready to add some animation. And all we want to do is whenever the drop down opens up, we want the content to slightly change in opacity as it loads in and move in from top to bottom by 5%. So to do that, first we'll go into drop down dash content and set its initial transform equal to translate y and make that minus 5%. So it starts off initially a bit higher than it should land up. And then in content dash open, we want the same translate y, but we want to set that to 0 and save that. Now, of course, it won't be visible right now. And to make it visible, the animation, we want to add a transition property. And we want to say for the transform property, take 150 ms and do ease dash in dash out. And for opacity, similarly, do 100 ms and ease dash in dash out. And now we can see when we open the drop down, it slightly animates by going down and increasing in opacity. Now, one thing to note is that the drop down content will be overlapping the button since it's at a y of minus 5% initially, and it might be hard to click on the buttons in some cases. So in this case, we'll set pointer events equal to none so that the cursor can't really click on it when it's in this state. But when it's open, we'll set the pointer events equal to all, so that once it's open, we can click on the items, but once it's closed, it doesn't interfere with clicking on the button. So as of now, the only way to close the dropdown is by clicking on the button itself, but we want it to be closable if we click outside anywhere. So to do that, we'll need to go inside dropdown.jsx and we'll need to import use effect and use ref from React. So what we'll do is firstly create a reference to the dropdowns. We'll say const dropdown ref is equal to use ref, And on this outermost div, we'll just say ref is equal to dropdown ref. And what this lets us do is basically attach a variable to an element or a component inside React. And this helps us detect whether this has been clicked or not. So to do that, we'll firstly create a use effect. And this is just some code which will get run whenever the dropdown ref gets attached to this element. And what we'll be doing inside this use effect is adding a handler to our application, which will detect for clicks. And whenever a click happens, it will check if the dropdown has been clicked or not. And if anywhere outside the dropdown has been clicked, then it will detect that and it will close down the dropdown. So we'll define the handlers. We'll say const handler is equal to taken an event and check if dropdown ref dot current. So there is something attached to the dropdown ref, and the dropdown ref dot current dot contains is not equal to event dot target. So whenever a click happens, it will release an event, and we want to check that the click event did not happen on the dropdown component which we have. So if a click did happen, but it wasn't clicked on the dropdown, that means we want to close our dropdown. So we can say set open equal to false. So that's our handler defined. Then we'll go inside here and we'll say document.add event listener. Listen to any click event on the document and then call the handler function when that happens, which will check what was clicked and close accordingly. Now in React, whenever you're adding an event handler like this, it's good to clean it up once your component is no longer on the page. So useEffect allows us to return cleanup functions, which are run whenever the component is removed from the page. So all you want to do is say document.remove event listener. On the click, we want to remove the given handler and save that. And now if we click on the dropdown, we see that we can close it as before, but we can also click outside and it gets closed as well because we've added this click event listener. Now the last thing we want to do is take care of the instances where our dropdown will be down too low. And if we open it, it'll render out outside the page. And to do that, we'll need to calculate the position of the dropdown dynamically. So the first step in that is that we need to attach references to both the content and the button as we did for the dropdown in the previous step. So see how we use the dropdown ref over here. We need to do that for both the button and the content, and we'll need to use it over here in our dropdown component. So we'll create two more refs. We'll call it button ref is equal to use ref, and we'll say const content ref is equal to use ref. Now we will pass it down over here. We'll say ref is equal to button ref, and then for the content we'll say ref is equal to content ref. Now if I save that, you'll see an error on the right hand side where it says that components don't accept a ref property unless you use something called react.forwardRef. So what we need to do in this case is, since these aren't actual HTML tags, they're components, we'll need to go inside dropdown button.jsx, and instead of it being a normal React functional component, we need to wrap it inside a function called forward ref from React. And we'll also wrap the end with parentheses. The props which we were taking in won't be taken anymore. Instead, forward ref takes in two props, which are props and ref. And what we can do is at the top, we can say const, whatever props we have is equal to props, and destructure the props value which we're getting over here inside forward ref. And then we can attach this ref value which we get to the outermost div. We can do the same thing inside dropdown content.jsx. So we'll say this is equal to forward ref from React, remove this props object, take in the props and the ref, close the parentheses here, and at the top say const this object is equal to props, and save that. And then we need to attach the ref to the outermost div. And now we can go back into dropdown.jsx and do the actual calculation of the y position. So we'll go to the toggle dropdown function, and we'll only need to calculate the position of the dropdown once we're opening it or closing it. So if it's not open, that means it's closed and it's going to open. We need to calculate the y position. So what we'll do first is we'll calculate the space remaining below the drop down button. So we'll say const space remaining, and that will be equal to the window.inner height, which is basically the height of the viewport. And we'll subtract the button ref dot current dot get bounding client rect dot bottom. So that's a very long line, but that basically means we're getting the current button, and we're getting the bounding rectangle around it, and we're getting the value of the bottommost position of the div. So if you take in the full height of the viewport and you subtract the bottom position of the button, you get the remaining space below it. Then we'll calculate the const content height. This will be equal to content ref dot current dot client height. So this is just the height of the content which will be rendered below the button once it's open. Then we need to calculate something called the const top position. We first check if the space remaining is greater than the content height, which means there's more than enough space for it, so we don't need to make it render any special way. If that is the case, then the top position will just be null. If there isn't enough space remaining, that means that the content has to be moved up. And since it's absolutely positioned, it'll have to be moved up negatively. So the top position will be a negative value, and it'll be calculated by taking the space that's remaining and subtracting the content height. Because obviously that's how much you need to move it up by so that it's not going outside the page. And we'll save that. Now we need to add a stateful variable which decides the top position of our content. So we'll say const dropdown top and set dropdown top is equal to use state, and initially it'll be 0, but over here once we calculate top position we'll say set dropdown top and set that equal to the top position which we just calculated. Now we're not currently using this, so what we need to do is go down into dropdown content and say top is equal to dropdown top. We'll go into dropdown content and take in the top prop, and since we want to change the styling right here, we'll use the style property. So we'll say style is equal to the top value is equal to, first we'll check if top exists, because if you remember it can be null if we don't want to do any changes. So if it does exist, what we want to do is set the top value to some string interpolation. So we'll say $top, which is the variable we got, and that many pixels. If it doesn't exist, just set that to 100%. And now if we check, it obviously opens up as normal if it's at the center of the page or at the top of the page. But if it's below here, it'll render up a bit higher so that it's not going outside the page as it was before. So that's about it. You learned how to make an animated drop down in React, which you can control by either opening and closing through the button, clicking outside, which can take in basically any child inside the menu, and also has a dynamic Y position based on the position of your dropdown. I hope you liked this tutorial and learned something new. If you did, please do subscribe, like the video and share it, and do join the Discord server linked in the comments and the description down below. Until next time, thanks for watching.